Hi, and welcome to another edition of Land and Book by Bible Passages. It's good to see you today. I want you to think about something interesting picture I have up here on the screen, actually from a picture taken back in the 1940s in Israel and in Jerusalem. There's a family here standing outside their house in what looks like some sort of a little hut. And that's exactly what it is. Well, what does that have to do with our lesson today, and in particular, John chapter 8, verse 12, which is really the chapter we're going to talk about in a few weeks, but nevertheless, the events associated with chapter 7 have an important bearing on our appreciation of John chapter 8, verse 12. All right, well, we are so thrilled to be able to talk about some of these things associated with the culture, the history, the geography, and the archaeology of the Bible lands in connection with the Gospel of John. And before we get right into the text, I just want to remind you to, if you don't mind, to like and subscribe and comment on our videos and our work overall, not because that helps us personally, but it helps the content to go out. And you know all about the algorithms with regard to social media, and the more of those comments and likes and all that get on there, then more people are going to see this material, and more people will be encouraged to draw closer to God. And that's really what we want. That's our aim. So if you don't mind, we would appreciate that, and certainly pray for us. All right, let's get right into the text. There are really two major things that I want us to notice today. One, very briefly, and that is just sort of the geographical movement associated with what is happening here in John chapter 7. Remember, a lot of our story so far has taken place in the northern country, in the area of Galilee, in that district around the Sea of Galilee. And the text says in John 7 that Jesus was in Galilee. His disciples are going to come on down here to Judea, so to this region where Jerusalem is located. And then later on, he will come down to this feast. So we don't know the direct route, but essentially up here to the north, where Nazareth, his hometown, Capernaum, where he had made his home in his public ministry, to the north. And then as a good Jewish young man, as a good Jewish man, he's going to go and celebrate one of these three of the solemn feasts that we'll talk about now. So secondly then, let's talk about this Sukkot, as it is in Hebrew, or the Feast of the Tabernacles. Notice in John chapter 7, we read in verse 2, now the Jews' feast of booths was at hand. That's the ESV translation, and other translations have that as well. Others have different wording there. And so I want us to talk a little bit about that today, because it's important to have a basic understanding of that particular feast day to better appreciate what we're going to read in John 7 and in John 8. Now remember, the Jews had a number of feasts that were a part of their calendar. And there are 7 that are mentioned in Leviticus 23, and then there are others that become associated with it, and then even ones like Purim, that's added a little bit later, and then national holidays like during the inter-biblical period that have to do with the dedication of the temple or the rededication of it, and with Hanukkah. And so a number, even more get added on, like Tisha B'Av and the remembering of the day that the temple was destroyed, in which Orthodox Jews may go down to the temple and actually mourn for the destruction of the temple. But as you can see, here are some of the major feast days, and we'll have time to talk about them perhaps in other segments or sessions. But the three that we're most concerned about very quickly are the solemn feast, the Passover feast, and that was in the first month of what is roughly equivalent to our March. They started their calendar with the Exodus from Egypt, and that was the month then that is celebrating Passover. And then there was the Feast of Tabernacles, our one that we're going to talk about today. And then the Feast of Weeks, which is also known as Pentecost, roughly 50 days after the Passover. And really, it is a celebration that came to be more of an emphasis on the giving of the law on Mount Sinai, though there was more associated with it than just that. So anyway, let's talk about this Feast of the Booths, and sometimes the Feast of Ingatherings, as we'll see. But what was its purpose? In essence, its main purpose was to do this: to commemorate the time that God took care of the people of Israel when they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. Remember, they'd been in slavery, they'd been in bondage to the Egyptians, and God sent this deliverer Moses to lead them out of Egypt. And after all the plagues, and then they went down and received the law. They were supposed to go to take the promised land, but 10 of the 12 spies did not have enough faith. The people of Israel did not have enough faith, and so that generation was forced to wander in the wilderness. But even though they were in the wilderness, God still took care of them. He loved his people. The next generation would go and take the promised land. But while they were in the wilderness, he provided for them. And they lived in tents, or temporary booths, as it were, moving about from place to place. And yet all of that time, God provided for them sustenance and water to drink, and the necessary things of life. And so what then are the names associated with this feast? Well, one of them, as we've already noted, is the word Sukkot. It's a Hebrew word, and the plural form of that word just means some sort of tent or hut that's made out of many types of branches. And so sometimes that word gets translated as a booth. And we're familiar with that, right? When you set up a booth, maybe at a fair, at a conference or something, it's just sort of a little square apparatus where you kind of have your materials contained in, and maybe you might have a little covering of some sort. And so we get the idea of a booth. And just like today, they did many, many years ago, they built temporary shelters. They do even this today. Many Orthodox Jews, like in Israel or in other places around the world, go outside of their homes. Some of them go camping, and just to get away and spend that time in those little temporary dwelling places, a tent, or in a structure like this with those palm branches over the top. So called the celebration or the festivities associated with booths, living in or spending time in these booths to remember God taking care of his people in the wilderness. And then sometimes it's called the Feast of the Tabernacle, and part of that reason is because the English word for tabernacle actually comes from a Latin word that means tent or hut. But normally we consider the tabernacle as being more this structure associated with where God's presence could be found above the cherubim in the Holy of Holies. And so it was God's tent. And that tent, though, as we're going to see, became more of a permanent structure in the temple, and a number of other traditions got associated with it. So that's why that name gets associated with this particular festivity known as the festivity or the festival of the booths, or Sukkot. And then another name that is associated with this, and it's important for us to understand this, and that is the word ingathering. Ingathering. The Torah referred to it in just this way in the book of Exodus. There, the feast of ingathering. Well, why ingathering? Well, we're going to see here in just a moment that this feast falls at the end of the year, or at least around the fall, so the growing season has come to an end. And what did they do with their produce throughout the year to get ready for the winter? They would store it. And this is a particular picture of a storage facility down in Beersheba. It was a trading city. This wasn't just one necessarily just for homes, but more than likely a larger area where a number of business owners and operators stored their grain. And so you can see that there were storage facilities, this one and many others that have been discovered in the Bible lands. So the produce, the agricultural products that were gleaned throughout the year, eventually stored, And then this became this particular feast, a time to sort of assess, to think about, to gather that produce, put it away, evaluate, but also to share it, especially with God, in a wonderful celebration. So when you think about the time of the year associated with this feast, it is a feast, again, connected to agricultural practices, as were many of the feasts associated with the Jews. God wanted his people to remember where their food came from, and also to rely upon him for the rain that they needed, both the early rain and the latter rain. You need that rain to when you're starting to plant, and for the seed to grow and for the plants to produce. And then when it gets time to harvest, you want a little bit of rain as well, and the rain to come near the end to sort of produce a bumper crop. But on each end of those, in the spring holidays and in the fall holidays, you can see where these particular feasts were gathered. So in essence, these feasts then had really a dual purpose, a dual significance. One was to recount historical events, like they're coming out of Egypt at the time of the Exodus. God redeemed them. But then also, God wanted it to be connected to their agricultural calendar. So this became that is, this Feast of Ingathering, the Sukkot, became sort of a Thanksgiving for them. It was a high holiday in many ways that brought a lot of celebration. Now, I couldn't help but wanted to share this with you, because even today you will find Jewish families that go down to the Western Wall. This is the wall that is a retaining wall that held up the entire Herodian temple complex. It's the most important shrine in modern day Judaism today, at least to many Orthodox Jews. And they believe it's the closest place on earth, basically, that you can get to God. The remnants of that temple, the retaining wall that held it up. So some people call it the Wailing Wall. But notice even today there are celebrations that occur down there. Listen to this. Okay, so whether it's that, or look at this, there's another one here I wanted to show you of some, if I can move it here a little bit further. Okay, here we go. And here are these children that are down there at a yeshiva school that have gathered there, and they're wearing little crowns. But notice again, this place in Jerusalem connected to a lot of festivities, rejoicing, celebrations, a fun time. They're kind of on a field trip here, as you will see. Cute little Jewish boys down there, all together with their some of the rabbis and their parents. Okay, so again, what's the purpose in all of that? It's basically to show that in Jerusalem, even today, there are families that gather there, times of celebration, joy, other events where there's a lot of singing and happiness that's going on. So I want you to remember that when you think about this Feast of the Booths, the Feast of the Tabernacle. Yes, to remember what God did in helping them through that wilderness experience, but also this is a time of year when the rain is going to slowly start coming back again, and they're taking assessment of what all they have been blessed with agriculturally over the years. Now, the requirements associated with this particular feast: a pilgrimage, as we've already noted, going back to Jerusalem, the festivities of rejoicing and fellowship, a holy convocation. So on the first day of the feast, there's to be no work. And then over the next several days, 7 days, there's going to be sacrifices and gifts, celebration and joy, expressions of joy at the temple and in Jerusalem. And then on the 8th day, there would be this period of rest again, and a couple of other, or something very interesting also that occurs that we'll talk about in just a moment on this 8th day. Then there is another additional distinctive requirement connected to this particular celebration, going back to the Torah, and was in existence during the time of Christ and still being practiced today by many Jews. And that is what's found here in Leviticus chapter 23, verse 40, when it says, "And you shall take for yourself on the first day the fruit of beautiful trees." We don't know what tree that is, but we'll show you which ones they use today. Branches of palm trees, the boughs of leafy trees, don't know which ones exactly, and willows of the brook, that is, "and you shall rejoice before the Lord." Okay? "And you shall do this for 7 days." So rejoicing, happiness, celebration. Well, what's the significance of these particular, what have been called the 4 species? Each of these species are things like a palm branch, an etrog, or some sort of citrus fruit. There was also then maybe a myrtle branch that was used, and then a willow branch. Now, there's been a lot of debate about what each of these symbolize and what they represent even today. You can talk to different Jews, different sectarian groups, that is, and you get different answers. One that I thought was of particular interest was that it represented different types of Jewish people, maybe from their background or of their persona or their attitude or whatever, but yet when they come together in this celebration, they're sort of all united, because you take these 4 species and unite them, and you hold the citrus in your left hand, and then these other elements from the agricultural world, from the world of flora and fauna, from the world of vegetation that God has created, and so it sort of represents Jewish people being bound together. But I like more the idea that what I was just showing you, that each of these sort of represent different aspects of the human body. Some say the palm branch, sort of the spine. If you look at it and kind of have an imagination of a palm branch, it does sort of look like maybe a human spine. And then maybe the citrus representing the heart, and you can see it does sort of look like a heart. And then the myrtle branches maybe representing some sort of like your eyes. And then the willow representing the lips. And so, what's the idea? The idea is this, that when we come together to worship God, we need to bind all that together and give our whole life as a consecrated, devoted service toward God. Give your whole being to God, because He's given all these things to you, and He's blessed you and made Himself visible through the natural world. He's manifested Himself in the natural world and in the agricultural world especially. So the Bible doesn't give us the specifics on what each of those represent, but I think coming from a agricultural society, they would have had to connect the beauty of the creation and what all those particular species might represent in terms of the things that God has created, how He created them, as just an opportunity to see the beauty in the world and to be joyous and happy as a result of what He's done. So those are the basic requirements from the Torah. Then as time goes by, another element emerges that we want to notice from the book of Leviticus, but also a tradition that developed outside of the book of Leviticus, and that was in existence during the time of Jesus. Now, to better understand these two that have a bearing on John 7 and chapter 8, we need to talk just quickly about the temple and the evolution of the tabernacle to the temple. Now remember, the tabernacle was a place where God or His presence could be manifested, moved around a bit wherever the people of God were in the wilderness. He was at the center, and the Ark of the Covenant is there, the altar of sacrifice, the menorah, all these pieces of furniture associated with the tabernacle that symbolize different things about God and His care and His greatness, His light, His forgiveness, the atonement that's needed to approach Him. All of that was found in the tabernacle. And then as time goes by, the tabernacle, as you know, became fixed in a permanent location during Solomon's era. And then by the time of Jesus, after the destruction of the temple by the Babylonians, the temple is rebuilt. It's added onto by the Hasmoneans in the 2nd century BC. And then King Herod the Great, right at the time around shortly before the birth of Jesus, expands the temple complex and makes it really a complex. Okay, so here is the temple, the inner sanctuary, the Naas, and then the Haran is the entirety of this temple. But notice there is added areas of worship for the women to come. It's called the Court of the Women. There is a barrier put around the entire complex where Gentiles could come and observe the celebrations and things that are happening. There's the royal stoa on that end where I think the money changers, at least initially, were located. And so this is a huge, huge place that required and needed a lot of different ancillary buildings associated with the work that went on at the temple because of all the constant sacrifices that were going on, and whether they were buildings like associated with holding wood or the olive oil for the burning of the lamps, or for the cleansing of hides for the priest to keep warm in. You've got a lot of different buildings here. You've got this, what is probably the Nicanor Gate, what some down here call the Beautiful Gate. But notice this courtyard area where the altar of sacrifice and the laver, we'll look at here in just a moment, was located. You go into the holy place and into the Holy of Holies. But in this area, there were 4, according to what we can ascertain from Josephus and the Mishnah, this written form of the oral tradition handed down by the Jews, that there were these large areas where these candelabras were, a lighting of maybe some other menorahs besides the menorah that was located in the holy place itself. And so in the Court of the Women, there were these, again, big, beautiful lights that were lit at night, and then sort of a certain celebration that took place, especially during the Feast of the Booths. So wanted you to take note of that and that particular tradition associated with that and that location. And then note this altar of sacrifice. So if you go back to this picture and we were to walk through the Nicanor Gate, we would see this, the altar of sacrifice, just as it was in the tabernacle, the laver over here for the washing of the priest and other ceremonial things associated with that. And then you go through the doors into the holy place and further into the Holy of Holies. So knowing something about the tabernacle and the temple particularly itself is important to appreciating what I'm going to tell you next. Okay? So what 2 important celebrations or events took place during the time of Jesus at the Feast of the Tabernacles? Number 1, there was the drink offering ceremony. The drink offering ceremony. And there is a reference to this even in Leviticus chapter 23. And I'll look at that and I'll come back to that picture. But notice this. So it says, on the 8th day, you shall have a holy convocation, and you shall make offerings made by fire to the Lord. And then to an offering made by fire to the Lord, a burnt offering, a grain offering, a sacrifice. And then this, a drink offering. Drink offerings are to be made on this 8th day. Now that's very interesting, isn't it? Think about a drink offering. Well, what was that about? And what was the purpose of a drink offering? It's sort of like saying, God, just as we were giving you our animals, the firstling of our flocks, or the food that we have so that we can be reminded that this is offered to you and you're sort of communing with us, we're also going to pour out what we have garnered from our vineyards. And we're giving everything to you. Some people say the drink offering is also sort of like when you drink, it's going inside of you and it's completely a part of you. And you're saying, God, I'm giving everything that would be in essence in me totally over to you. So this drink offering was a part of their heritage, going back to the book of Leviticus, just like animal sacrifices, just like grain or food sacrifices, and you have a drink libation or a pouring it out, saying, I'm going to give it to you, God. You're more important than me. All right? So that's found in Leviticus chapter 23. Now, I want you to notice, get down here, go past these, that when you think about the significance of maybe grape juice or wine being poured out, or even this water, as in this ceremony it's going to be, how precious water is. Water is so significant. Water, without it, you can't live. It's needed for their crops. And so because of that connection to the necessity of water, the importance of water, God used water as imagery for not only what he gives to sustain people, to help them spiritually, but also as sort of a view, according to Isaiah 12, verse 3, of this new messianic age and something that is going to start afresh and anew. Now, the Feast of Booths takes place in October, roughly our October. And so that's in the 7th month of the Jewish calendar of Tishri. And that is right there at the edge of the rainy season. You got two major rainy seasons in the land of Israel, even today, the early rain and the latter rain. And so in between there, don't get a whole lot of rain. It's a very unusual thing. So you need the rain to come. You can't miss a rainy season if you're going to have the crops that you need to sustain you physically. So we've got to have this rain. So just imagine you're not quite into this rainy season yet. It's about to start, and you're pouring water out. You're saying, God, we trust you. We're relying upon you. We need you. And so we're going to pour this out and offer it to you in hopes of this next rainy season that's going to begin. Now, that particular practice actually started, and this is very significant now in our story, at the time of Jesus. It started right here at the pool of Siloam. So all the way down here at the end of this, what's known as the city of David, where David first built his palace here in Jerusalem and the city expanded northward, there was a pool. Hezekiah's tunnel was dug through this eastern hill and emptied its waters down into this pool area. And I believe that it was a water reservoir for people living on the western side of the city of David. But it also was a place for ritualistic bathing and washing as people prepared themselves to go up to the temple. Now we're going to encounter a man who was sent later on in John down here to wash in this pool. He was sent by Jesus here. He was blind. He was sent to wash in this pool. But Jews, especially those coming from the south, would stop here, ritualistically wash themselves, and then go up what's called the Pilgrim's Way, ascending up into the temple. Now, on the 8th day of this particular feast, the priest would come down here to the pool of Siloam, and they would take their golden vessel and dip water in this pool and then walk up the Pilgrim's Way in this elaborate ceremony. What are they going to do? They're going to go all the way up into the temple, and they're going to pour out that water as a libation, as an offering to God at the altar. So that's what's happening when you see sort of reflected in this picture as a reminder of what they were doing at the time of Jesus. So number one, the Feast of Booths is, yes, a celebration to remember what God did in sustaining them in the wilderness, remembering how he even gave them water. They need water. God, we're going to pour out this water as an offering to you. But the second thing that came to be associated with this particular feast was called the illumination of the temple ceremony. And it was interesting, so that throughout this feast, there was sort of this neat ceremony that involved young men that would climb a ladder, and they would take the garments of the old garments of a priest and tie them up really tight and use them as sort of wicks to put into these bowls, and they would fill the oil in here and they would light them in each of those big candelabras, then would burn. So here we've got these 4 in the court of the women, 4 different, there's 2 here and 2 on the other side you can't see here. that would burn at night. And in fact, some of the writers like Josephus, historian of the past, and in the Mishnah speak about the entire city. Courtyards of people's homes in Jerusalem were lit up because of those 4 particular lights that were burning at night during this celebration. What would the men do on the 7th day? Throughout the night, the men would come and they would dance around these poles and celebrations, sort of like I was showing you those men earlier who came down and they were joyous and happy. They're all dancing around in celebration of the fact that God gives light and what that light represents and what it means and how significant it is. Then some say, and I haven't verified this yet, but on that 8th day is when that light would be put out, because it's the end of now this growing season, and now they're going into winter, and so they're going to be looking for a sort of a recycle or renewal of a new time and a new era now for this new harvest and new agricultural cycle to begin after, when the next rains will come in the spring. So interesting, this lighting of the candles, the water ceremony, all of that was a very important part of the festivities associated with this Feast of the Tabernacle, the Feast of the Booths, Sukkot, read about in John 7. Now, what is all that about? Well, here's the best part of all, and that is how it was fulfilled in Jesus. These feasts, each one of them, are fulfilled in Jesus. They are sort of foreshadows of Jesus. We understand the Passover is a foreshadowing of Jesus as the Paschal Lamb, as the sacrifice. But what about the Feast of the Tabernacles? How is that a fulfillment? Well, Jesus said in John 7:37 through 39, that on the last day of this feast, and the greatest day of the feast, Jesus stood and said in a loud voice, "If anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scripture has said, streams of living water will flow from within him." By this he meant the Spirit, whom those who believed in him were later to receive. Up to that time, the Spirit had not been given, since Jesus had not yet been glorified. So that particular imagery of the libation offering and the water being poured out, Jesus makes an immediate connection and says, you're going through this process in hopes that you'll be refreshed year by year. I'm going to send you the Spirit. I'm going to pour out my Spirit upon you. And if you drink of that, if you're thirsty, come and drink of that Spirit. Jesus said something very similar to that in John chapter 4, didn't he? So he makes this connection and saying, I'm the fulfillment of that. You don't need to look any further. And then, of course, the lighting ceremony. Jesus, in the same context now, in chapter 8, says, I am the light of the world. There are some who say that, again, on that 8th day, they extinguished that light and like to make a connection that as soon as that light was extinguished in the court of the women, that Jesus stood up and said, I am the light of the world. If you want to be able to see, if you want to be able to find your way in life, you don't have to go through this physical building of the temple. Come through me, this living temple that would be resurrected from the dead, his body, and through the life and ministry of Jesus. Jesus truly is the light of the world, and it's pretty exciting to think about his being the fulfillment of each of these feasts that are presented in the Gospel of John, not just given as time markers for a chronology of his ministry, much more than that, but really are pointing us to the magnificence, the greatness of God and what he gives, and in his plan of redemption and the foreshadowing that took place in the feast that the children of Israel were to practice, that are ultimately fulfilled then in Jesus Christ. So just one more little connection. Much more could be said, so much more to learn, but maybe we need to think a little more deeply about what's said here in John 7 about the Feast of the Tabernacles, the Feast of Booths, in connection to Jesus as we think about the land and the book. Thank you for joining us today.